You must be joking, Mrs. Thompson. Ethan Carter's voice sliced through the room like a cold blade. He leaned back in his leather chair, eyes locked on the trembling woman in front of him, clutching a worn-out purse in her lap. Your late husband left over $30,000 in debt. Do you really think a handful of empty promises will make that disappear? I'm begging you, Mr. Carter. I have nothing left to give. I've sold everything. All I have now is my faith and my daughter. His expression didn't change, but one eyebrow lifted slightly. Your daughter? Emily, she's 19, smart, kind, hardworking. If you could give her a chance at your firm, as a secretary, maybe it could help settle some of the debt, little by little. Ethan stood slowly, the tailored fabric of his dark suit clinging to his broad shoulders. He moved to the window of his 27th floor office, staring down at the glowing city skyline. The golden hue of the setting sun highlighted the sharp lines of his jaw and the cold calculation in his eyes. Your husband lied in court, accused me of fraud. Do you know how long it took me to clear my name? Mrs. Thompson lowered her head in shame. He made mistakes, but Emily, she's nothing like him. He turned to face her. His voice was calm, but laced with something darker. You're asking me to accept the daughter of the man who tried to ruin me into my business? Out of pity? Not pity, just mercy. Please. Ethan approached, standing close enough for her to catch the bold, woodsy scent of his cologne. Dominant, masculine, and expensive. Fine, he said flatly. Have her here Monday morning, 8 a.m. sharp. But understand something, Mrs. Thompson. He paused, his voice dipping lower. If she steps through my door, she's mine. The woman blinked back tears and nodded silently. He opened the office door for her with calm precision, already calculating. When the door closed behind her, he smiled to himself. The game had begun, and Ethan Carter never played to lose. Emily stepped out of the elevator, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. The marble floors gleamed beneath her flats, and the air smelled of leather, money, and something faintly citrus, expensive and intimidating. She was painfully aware of how simple she looked in her light floral dress and barely there makeup. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder with each step toward the glass doors of Ethan Carter's office. The receptionist didn't even look up. Name? Emily Thompson. I'm supposed to start today. After a moment scanning her screen, the woman pressed a button. Go ahead. 27th floor. Mr. Carter is expecting you. The elevator ride was slow. Her palms were damp. Her mind raced. She still didn't fully understand what this job was. Her mother had insisted it was a great opportunity, but something about the way she said it felt unfinished. When the doors opened, he was already waiting. Ethan Carter stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, the late morning sun casting a golden edge on the sharp outline of his body. He turned slowly, and the second their eyes met, Emily froze. Tall, broad-shouldered, shirt unbuttoned halfway down, revealing sculpted abs and a powerful chest. His skin was sun-kissed, the veins visible along his forearms. No tie, no smile, just those icy blue eyes that studied her like a puzzle he was already solving. Emily, he said her name like a slow verdict. Come in. Her voice caught in her throat. She nodded instead, stepping inside with caution, barely able to swallow. He circled her slowly, deliberately, his gaze trailing over her body with unspoken authority. Her breasts rose and fell with nervous breath, the thin fabric of her dress clinging to her hips and waist, outlining curves she hadn't meant to highlight. He stopped behind her. She could feel the warmth of his breath on her neck. Your mother spoke highly of you, he murmured, his tone low, intimate. Said you were respectful, obedient, and pure. Her eyes widened. I don't understand. He stepped in front of her again, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his chest. Oh, you do, he said, brushing a finger along her arm. His touch was slow, deliberate, igniting goosebumps in its path. You just don't want to admit it. Emily's heart pounded. Her body trembled, not with fear, but confusion, heat, something unnameable. She took a step back, needing space. He let her go, smiling like a man who enjoyed the chase. "I'll show you to your desk," he said simply, turning and walking ahead, his back muscles shifting beneath the fabric of his shirt. She followed, pulse racing, skin tingling where his fingers had grazed her. She didn't know what this place was, or who, exactly, Ethan Carter was, but something told her she was already in his game, and the rules were his. The morning dragged with slow intensity. Emily sat at a sleek glass desk in a separate office space just outside his. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over the keyboard as she tried to make sense of the tasks Ethan had left for her. Handwritten notes, a planner filled with overlapping schedules, and a list of appointments that made little sense. Every few minutes, the intercom buzzed. "Bring me the Carter Foundation file." "Come in. I want you to read this aloud." "Close the door." Each call was another test, another excuse to summon her into his space. And every time she walked in, he was there, always relaxed, always perfectly posed, always watching. Late in the morning, she bent to retrieve a folder from the floor. When she rose, Ethan was already in front of her, eyes locked on the curve of her hips. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees warmer. "Did you choose that dress on purpose?" he asked, voice low, eyes sharp. Her heart skipped. "No." "It suits you," he said, stepping closer, his gaze sliding down her body like silk. "You have a very classic figure." She backed away, unsure if she should thank him or run. By midday, he asked her into his office again. She entered carefully, arms crossed over her chest, sensing the way his eyes tracked her every movement. He leaned against his desk, shirt still partly unbuttoned, revealing the deep line that cut between his abs. His sleeves were rolled up now, forearms flexed and tanned, veins pronounced, a visual invitation to imagine those hands doing things no one ever dared say out loud. "Tell me, Emily," he said as she stood a few feet away. "Why are you really here?" "My mother said it would help pay the debt," he smirked, shaking his head. "That's what she told you, but I wonder, are you always so trusting?" His eyes dropped to her lips. She licked them unconsciously. A mistake. In 2 strides, he was in front of her again. He reached out, not quite touching, his hand hovering just beside her waist, so close she could feel the heat. "You're afraid of me," he murmured. "But not in the way you think." She stared back, her breath shaky. "No, I'm not." He leaned in until his mouth was next to her ear. His breath was warm, slow, intoxicating. "Then prove it." Emily's entire body tightened. She could feel her nipples hardening beneath the thin fabric of her bra, her thighs pressing together as something primal bloomed low in her belly. But instead of answering, she stepped back. Just 1 pace. He didn't chase. He smiled, that same quiet, dangerous smile, and turned back to his desk. "You can go," he said casually. "For now." Emily left the room with her heart pounding, heat pooling between her legs, and her mind screaming questions she didn't know how to answer. She had never been touched like that, not with fingers, but with words, eyes, and proximity. And somehow it felt more dangerous than anything else. The invitation came in the form of a handwritten note, slid across her desk just before she was about to leave. 5 words in bold masculine handwriting, "Dinner tonight, rooftop where red." Emily stared at the message, her fingers trembling. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a command. It was a line drawn in the sand, daring her to cross it, and part of her wanted to. Hours later, she stood in front of the mirror in a simple red dress, sleeveless, short, just enough to show the curve of her hips, the soft swell of her cleavage. The thin straps kissed her shoulders, and the way the fabric hugged her body left little to the imagination. Her lips matched the dress. Her pulse throbbed in her neck. She hated how much she wanted him to see her. When she stepped onto the rooftop, she found Ethan already there, back to her, whiskey in hand, city lights painting his silhouette. He wore black, always. But tonight, no blazer. Just a button down, open deep enough to reveal that perfect chest, the shadows of muscle and a hint of danger. He turned slowly. His gaze swept over her in one long, consuming drag that made her knees weaken. "You wore it," he said. "You told me to." He stepped forward, the space between them electric. "You didn't have to," he said, lowering his voice, "but you did." Dinner was a blur. Small talk was a game. Every look, every sip, every breath was a slow push towards something neither of them could name, but both of them could feel. He never stopped watching her. She never stopped wondering how far she'd let him go. Then, just as dessert arrived, Ethan leaned in, his tone dark and unflinching. "Do you know why you're here, Emily?" Her breath caught. "You offered me a job." "No. That's what your mother thought I agreed to." He took a sip of his drink, never breaking eye contact. "But the truth is, she offered you to me. As payment." Her world stilled. "I don't believe you." He leaned in farther. The candlelight danced in his eyes. "You don't want to believe me." She stood abruptly, the chair scraping. Her hands shook. "I'm not some transaction." He rose too, slow and smooth. "Then why are you still here?" Emily stared at him, chest heaving, lips parted. Rage and confusion swirled with something darker, something she didn't want to name, desire. "You want me to walk away?" she asked, voice sharp. "No," he said, stepping close enough that she could smell his skin, warm, spiced, intoxicating. "I want you to admit what you're really afraid of." She didn't move. He leaned in, and for one dangerous second their lips almost touched. Then she turned and walked. Fast. Her heels clicked against the concrete, heart pounding in her ears. She didn't stop until she was back on the ground, breathless, shaking, furious, but more than anything else aroused. Not because he touched her, because he didn't, and she wanted him to. Emily slammed the door of her apartment behind her, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. She kicked off her heels, yanked the red dress over her head, and stood in the middle of the room in nothing but her panties and bra, her body still pulsing with adrenaline, and something hotter. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, skin flushed, hair messy, lips swollen from the tension of words left unsaid. The bastard had gotten into her head. The way he said it. "She offered you to me." The way he looked at her. Not just as a woman, but as a possession he planned to unwrap slowly. The way he didn't touch her, even when she wanted it. And now, her body refused to forget. Every inch of her skin buzzed like a live wire. Her nipples strained against the lace of her bra. Her thighs pressed together, desperate for friction. Then, a knock. She froze. A part of her already knew. When she opened the door, Ethan stood there, eyes shadowed, shirt sleeves rolled up, chest rising slowly. "I shouldn't have let you leave like that," he said, voice low, raw. "You said enough," she replied, stepping back instinctively, but not enough to close the door. He walked in slowly, like a lion entering familiar territory, and shut the door behind him with a click. The air between them was suffocating. Emily backed away, the tension in her muscles so tight it ached. She didn't realize how exposed she was, bare legs, thin bra, flushed cheeks, until his gaze dropped to her chest and stayed there. "You came to finish humiliating me?" she asked, voice trembling. "No," he answered, stepping closer, voice rough with restraint. "I came because I can't stop thinking about the way you looked at me when I told you the truth. Like you hated me, and still wanted me." She didn't deny it. Couldn't. He closed the space between them in one move, and this time, he didn't ask. His mouth crashed onto hers with hunger that stole her breath. One hand gripped the back of her neck, the other slid down her waist, wrapping firmly around her lower back and pulling her flush against his body. The heat of him, his bare skin under the rolled sleeves, his hard chest pressing against her sensitive breasts, the subtle grind of his hips against hers, all of it ignited her. She whimpered into his mouth as his tongue found hers, deep and deliberate. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. He walked her backward until her body hit the wall. His hand slid under her thigh, lifting it, hooking her leg around his hip. The pressure between her legs built fast. His erection strained against his pants, grinding against the wet heat of her panties. She gasped as his mouth traveled down her jaw, her neck, to the swell of her breasts, kissing, sucking, devouring. Her head fell back, her fingers tangled in his hair, her hips bucked, and when his teeth grazed her nipple through the lace, her knees almost gave out. He looked up at her, eyes wild. "Say stop, and I'll stop." She didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she grabbed his face and pulled his mouth back to hers. And in that kiss, and that reckless, searing kiss, everything inside her surrendered. It wasn't just lust. It was fury. It was fire. It was something dangerous that neither of them knew how to control, and neither wanted to. The room was dim, but the heat between their bodies lit everything. Ethan lifted Emily in one motion, her legs wrapping tightly around his waist, her back pressed against the cool wall, her chest heaving against his. His hands gripped her thighs, fingers sinking into her soft skin, holding her as if letting go wasn't an option. Her panties were soaked, not from fear, not from shame, but from want, desperate and uncontrollable. Their mouths were still fused, tongues tangling, breathing each other in like oxygen. Every kiss was deeper, every touch more urgent. He carried her to the bed, laying her down gently like she was something fragile, then crawling over her like a man starved. His body hovered above hers, firm, hot, heavy with restraint. She arched her back, offering herself, silently begging for more. His fingers trailed up her sides, brushing under the lace of her bra until he found the clasp and undid it with ease. The fabric slid away, revealing her fully. Ethan paused. His eyes drank her in. Her breasts rising with each breath, nipples peaked, skin flushed and sensitive. He bent down slowly, lips brushing the curve of one breast before pulling her nipple into his mouth, warm, wet, slow. Emily gasped, one hand flying to his hair, the other gripping the sheets beneath her. Her thighs shifted, hips lifting in instinctive need. His tongue circled, teased, then moved to the other side, repeating the same worship. "You're perfect," he murmured against her skin. "Every part of you." He kissed a line down her stomach, his fingers already sliding her panties off her hips. She lifted herself slightly, allowing him to pull them down. Her legs trembled, her breath caught. She was bare, exposed, and more turned on than she'd ever imagined possible. He paused again, watching her, really watching, as if memorizing how she looked in this moment, wild, undone, glistening for him. Then his mouth lowered. The first touch of his tongue between her thighs made her cry out, not loud but raw. He licked her slowly, savoring her, his hands keeping her hips pinned while she writhed beneath him. Every movement of his tongue was precise, skilled, relentless. She clawed at the sheets, her body tense and trembling. He sucked gently on her clit, and her entire spine arched. "Ethan, please," she moaned, breathless. He looked up, lips glistening with her desire, and smiled darkly. "You taste like sin." Then he moved up her body, sliding between her legs, the head of his length thick and hard against her entrance. He held himself there, teasing, rubbing slowly, making her whimper. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice shaking with restraint. She wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him close. "Yes, don't hold back." With one deep thrust, he entered her. She gasped, her body stretching to take him, her hands clutching at his back, nails digging into muscle. He stilled for a second, forehead resting against hers as if trying to hold on to the moment. Then he moved, slow at first, deep, purposeful. Every stroke touched something inside her she didn't know existed. They moved together, sweat beading on their skin, breath heavy and hot. Moans filled the room, hers sweet and broken, his low and guttural. His hands were everywhere, gripping her hips, caressing her breasts, sliding behind her neck to kiss her again. When she came, it hit like a wave, crashing and uncontrollable. Her whole body trembled, her cries muffled against his shoulder. He followed seconds later, thrusting deep and hard, burying himself in her with a groan that rumbled through his chest. They stayed like that, bodies tangled, hearts racing, and for the first time in both their lives, there was no need to speak, because everything real had just been said, with skin, breath, and surrender. The first light of morning spilled through the blinds in soft stripes, crawling across the tangled sheets, over the bare curve of her hip, and across his chest, rising and falling slowly with each breath. Emily stirred first. Her body ached deliciously, not with pain but with the lingering memory of how completely she had been taken. Every muscle held the echo of his touch, his hands gripping her hips as he moved deeper inside her, his mouth marking paths down her neck and across her breasts, his breath hot against her skin as he whispered her name in that dark, broken tone. She shifted slightly, feeling his arm still wrapped around her waist. Ethan slept behind her, warm and solid, one hand splayed across her stomach, fingers curled possessively over her skin. His body molded to hers like they had done this for years, like it was the only place either of them truly fit. She didn't want to move, but her heart was already racing again, not with desire this time, but with something more dangerous. Doubt. Was last night real, or just another game? Before she could answer that question in her own head, she felt his lips press softly against the back of her shoulder. A kiss so gentle it sent a shiver through her, waking every nerve. "I know you're awake," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep and gravel. Emily didn't reply. She only exhaled, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. His hand slid slowly up from her stomach to her chest, fingers spreading between her breasts, then cupping one with a firm yet reverent grip. His thumb brushed over her nipple, already taut from anticipation, and she let out a quiet gasp. "I can't stop touching you," he whispered, pressing another kiss at the base of her neck. "Even when I try." She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch his eyes. They weren't cold this morning. They were clear, raw, and honest. "You don't have to stop," she whispered back. He rolled her gently onto her back, hovering over her now, the sheets slipping down his hips. His body was gloriously bare, chest sculpted and warm, hair slightly messy, eyes locked onto hers with something deeper than just lust. His fingers trailed down her collarbone across the valley between her breasts and lower, tracing her ribs, her waist, her hip. Everywhere he touched, he left sparks in his wake. He leaned down and kissed her again, slow, sensual, with the kind of hunger that came not from the body but the soul. Their bodies found rhythm again, less urgent this time, more reverent. Each thrust was deep and controlled, every breath shared in kisses and quiet moans. She wrapped her legs around him, nails digging into his back, her head falling back as her body began to rise again with that impossible need. He buried his face in her neck, his voice a low growl against her skin. "You make me lose control." And she loved it. Loved knowing she could break the man who broke everyone else. Loved that with her, Ethan Carter wasn't in charge. He was just hers. When they finished, breathless and trembling, she pulled him close, and for the first time he didn't resist. He stayed, chest pressed to hers, heart against heart. And neither one said a word, because now they both knew this wasn't just lust. It was becoming everything. For 3 days Ethan didn't call. No texts, no unexpected visits, no instructions slid under her door in bold handwriting. Emily tried to convince herself she was fine, that the silence was a good thing, a break from the chaos, the confusion, the overwhelming pull between them, but her body betrayed her. Every time her phone vibrated, her heart leapt. Every night, she rolled into bed expecting, hoping, to feel the weight of his body slide in beside hers. And every morning she woke alone. She couldn't erase the feeling of his skin on hers, the sound of his breath when he lost control inside her, the heat in his eyes when he said nothing at all. But now, he was gone, as if none of it had ever happened. Was it just sex to him? She tried to focus on work at the firm, tried to move through the day like she wasn't unraveling inside, but everything around her whispered his name. The chair where he made her read legal briefs while watching her legs cross and uncross, the table where he pinned her hands and kissed her until she couldn't breathe, the damn scent of him, cedarwood and skin, that lingered in the office like a phantom. It was late afternoon when Janelle, the firm's veteran assistant, stopped by her desk. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Emily nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. Janelle gave her a look, the kind women give each other when they know. "Careful with Mr. Carter," she warned softly. "That man doesn't get close, he gets what he wants, and then—" She trailed off. She didn't have to finish. That night, Emily went home early. She took a shower, hoping the heat would melt away the tension in her chest, the ache between her thighs that hadn't left since he'd touched her. She stepped out, dripping wet, wrapped in a towel that clung to her curves. Her skin glowed with heat. Her nipples tightened from the sudden rush of cool air. She stood in front of the mirror and stared at her reflection, hands on the counter. Her body still held the memory of his touch, the way he filled her, the way he watched her come undone. And suddenly she wasn't angry. She was starved. As if on cue, a knock sounded at her door. She didn't move at first, just stood there, heart pounding, towel clinging to her damp body. Another knock. She wrapped the towel tighter and opened the door. And there he was. Ethan. Hair a little messier than usual, jacket in hand, jaw clenched, eyes wild. Neither of them spoke. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and before she could think, his hand was around her waist, his mouth on hers. She dropped the towel, and he caught her. His mouth moved like he hadn't tasted her in years, tongue urgent, teeth grazing, hands gripping every inch of wet skin he could find. She moaned into his kiss, wrapping her legs around him as he pressed her against the wall. The towel hit the floor, her back hit the tile, and Ethan hit every nerve in her body as if he'd spent 3 days memorizing her absence. Their bodies met again, this time faster, harder, hungrier. She was soaked, trembling, clutching at his back as he drove into her like a man desperate to prove something. And maybe he was, because when he came, it wasn't just a release, it was a confession, a wordless, breathless admission that this wasn't over, and maybe it never would be. The room was still, heavy, the kind of silence that comes only after bodies have collided with such force. There's nothing left to say. Emily lay on her back, hair fanned across the pillow, her chest slowly rising and falling. Beads of sweat glistened along her collarbone, trailing down between her breasts, catching the light like tiny stars. Her skin was flushed and damp, legs tangled with his, and her lips, swollen, parted, still tasted of him. Ethan lay beside her, arm draped over her waist, hand curved possessively against the curve of her lower back. His breathing hadn't quite calmed, neither Tinha. There was something unfinished still pulsing between them, even after everything their bodies had said. She turned her head toward him, catching the sharp line of his jaw, the tension still held in his brow, even in rest. "You disappeared," she said, voice soft but firm. 3 days. He blinked, once, twice, then stared at the ceiling. "I needed to think." "Think?" Her voice trembled. "You had no problem touching me like I was yours, but when it came to actually being with me, you vanished." His eyes snapped to hers. "I didn't vanish," he bit out. "I ran. There's a difference." Her heart clenched. He sat up, resting his elbows on his knees, dragging a hand down his face. "I'm not used to this," he muttered, "whatever this is. With you, everything feels like it's on fire. I can't breathe around you. I can't sleep. I can't think." Emily sat up too, the sheet slipping from her chest. His eyes dropped only for a second before he clenched his jaw and looked away. "You don't get to use that as an excuse," she whispered. "You don't get to sleep with me, hold me like that, and then decide it's too much." He looked at her, really looked, and something inside him cracked. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice lower now, unsteady. "When your mother offered you as payment, I was angry. I wanted revenge, power, control. But when you walked into that office, it was over." Emily's breath caught. "You weren't a deal. You weren't a transaction. You were this shock to my system. Everything I knew stopped working." He reached out, cupping her face gently, brushing his thumb across her cheek. "When I touched you, it wasn't about owning you. It was about feeling something real. For the first time in years." Her throat tightened. "Then why keep pushing me away?" His lips curved into a broken smile. "Because I didn't think I deserved you, and I still don't." She leaned into his touch, her hand covering his. "Maybe you don't," she said softly, "but I still want you." That was all it took. He pulled her into his lap, kissing her like a man starving all over again. Her legs straddled his hips, bare skin against bare skin. heat reigniting between them. His mouth trailed down her neck, across her chest, over her breasts. He sucked, licked, worshipped, making her gasp and grind against the hardness growing beneath her. She reached between them, wrapping her fingers around him, hard, thick, pulsing, and guided him to her, slowly, intimately. When he entered her, they both groaned. It wasn't wild this time. It was deep, steady, raw. His hands on her hips, guiding her, lifting her, making her ride him slow and controlled, like he wanted to feel every second. She rocked against him, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on his. "I don't want you to run anymore," she whispered, voice breaking. "I won't," he promised, thrusting deeper, his voice a vow between clenched teeth. "Not from you." Their bodies moved together until the tension shattered again, leaving them shaking, breathless, and clinging to each other like they might fall apart otherwise. And when sleep finally came, Ethan didn't leave. He stayed, wrapped in her arms, in her scent, in everything he never thought he'd find. The morning sun poured through the bedroom window like golden silk, casting a warm glow over their naked bodies, still tangled in sweat-damp sheets. Emily woke first, her cheek pressed against Ethan's chest, her leg draped over his thigh. His hand rested on her lower back, possessive even in sleep. She listened to his heartbeat, slow, steady, anchoring her in a way nothing else ever had. But reality crept in. She knew this couldn't stay hidden forever. The firm, her mother, the deal. People would talk. And deep down, a part of her still wondered, was this love or just an escape? Later that day, she arrived at the office expecting distance, coldness, a return to the man he was before. But instead, as she walked through the lobby, she noticed eyes turning, whispers, phones raised discreetly. She climbed the stairs, stomach tight, and stepped into the boardroom. Ethan stood at the head of the long glass table in a perfectly tailored navy suit, no tie, top buttons open, chest just barely visible. He looked like power in human form. But his eyes found hers, and everything stopped. He reached for the microphone set up for a shareholders' meeting, cleared his throat. Then, "I need to address something before we begin," he said, voice clear, cutting through the room. Everyone went still. "I made a decision weeks ago that was unconventional. I brought someone into this company under circumstances that were personal, emotional." He looked directly at Emily now. "She didn't ask to be here. She didn't manipulate her way in, and she sure as hell didn't deserve the gossip I know has started." Murmurs rippled around the room. Ethan raised a hand to silence them. His voice dropped. "I fell for someone. Unexpectedly, deeply. And if that breaks the rules, then so be it." Every breath in the room caught, especially hers. Emily stood frozen, her heart thundering in her chest. He wasn't just acknowledging her, he was claiming her, publicly, proudly. He walked toward her, slowly, each step deliberate, and then, in front of his entire board, he kissed her, not soft, not tentative, but with purpose. His hand cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. Her body melted into his, mouth opening beneath his in surrender. The room spun, or maybe the world did, because when his lips met hers, nothing else mattered. She tasted his promise in that kiss, felt his pulse in the way his body pressed into hers, and when he pulled back, just enough to whisper against her lips, "You're mine, Emily." In every way, she believed him. Everyone else faded, because the fire between them had just turned into something even more dangerous. Love exposed, and there was no turning back. The air shifted after that kiss. What was once a private fire between them had become a public blaze, and with it came heat from every direction. Rumors, backlash, eyes that watched Emily wherever she moved, voices that whispered as she passed. Ethan tried to shield her from it. He cancelled meetings, pushed back court dates, and pulled her into his office more often, like he couldn't bear to be apart. But that only fueled the talk, and the pressure inside her. That night, back in his penthouse, things felt different. She stood near the window in nothing but one of his white dress shirts, the fabric barely brushing the top of her thighs, her legs bare, her nipples pressed against the thin cotton, her hair messy from his hands, her lips still bruised from the last kiss. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, shirt open, chest exposed, watching her with something darker in his eyes. Not lust, not yet, but a storm. "I made everything worse for you," he said, voice low. "No," she replied quietly. "You didn't." He stood slowly, walking toward her with that quiet intensity that always made her knees soften. He cupped her face with both hands, pressing his forehead to hers. "You changed everything, Emily. I don't know who I am without you anymore, and that terrifies me." She swallowed hard, feeling his breath on her lips. "Then don't try to be anything else." He kissed her again, this time with no audience, no statements, no restraint. Just need. He lifted her with ease, carrying her to the bed, laying her down like she was breakable, then climbing over her like he wanted to shatter her anyway, piece by piece. His hands slid up her thighs, parting them slowly. His fingers brushed against her heat through the thin fabric of her panties, soaked already. She gasped, hips bucking, eyes closing. "Say it," he whispered. "Say what?" she breathed. "That you're mine." She opened her eyes and met his. "I've always been." The words snapped something in him. He ripped the panties down her legs in one swift motion, his mouth following the path, hot kisses over her inner thighs, his tongue teasing her until she was shaking. She threaded her fingers into his hair, moaning his name as his mouth took full possession of her, slow, wet, relentless. When she was panting, trembling, begging, he moved up her body, kissing every inch of her skin, stomach, ribs, breasts, until she was arching beneath him, desperate. Then he entered her, and the world disappeared. His thrusts were deep, slow, devastating. One hand tangled in her hair, the other gripping her thigh as he moved inside her like he needed to claim her from the inside out. She cried out his name again and again, breathless, undone, and he swallowed every sound with his mouth on hers, like he couldn't get enough. Their bodies collided over and over, sweat slick between them, skin against skin, moans and gasps blending in the dark. And when they both shattered, her body convulsing around him, his groan buried in her shoulder, it wasn't just climax. It was surrender, to the fire, to the truth, to the love that had taken them both by force, and neither of them wanted to be saved. Days passed, but time no longer moved the same. Everything between them had changed, or maybe it had finally settled into what it was always meant to be. Emily and Ethan didn't play games anymore. No more pretending it was casual. No more hiding behind lust. But the world didn't care about their truth. The media circled like vultures. Whispers turned into accusations. And one morning, an emergency board meeting was called. Ethan's position, his company, his empire, was under threat. It wasn't about her. It was about what she represented. Control lost, vulnerability exposed, and a man who'd finally chosen love over power. "I'm going to step down," he said that night, voice steady but distant as they stood in his penthouse, the city burning behind them. "Let the vultures have it. I've already won." Emily turned, stunned. "You'd give it all up? For me?" He crossed the room, took her face in his hands and kissed her like it was the last time. But it wasn't desperation. It was devotion. "I gave up the second I met you. Everything since then was just surrender." She searched his eyes. There was no performance left in him, only rawness. "You don't have to prove anything," she whispered. "I know," he said, pressing his forehead to hers. "But I want to." That night, he didn't take her fast. There was no urgency, no punishment in his touch, only reverence. He undressed her slowly, fingers sliding over her shoulders, down her arms, making her shiver with each inch of exposed skin. He kissed every part of her like it had meaning, the curve of her waist, the dip of her spine, the inside of her wrists. When she was naked beneath him, he took his time worshipping her body. His mouth moved over her breasts, tongue circling each nipple until they peaked, and she arched into him. His hands stroked her thighs, opened her slowly, lips brushing the inside until she begged for more. And when he finally entered her, it was different. There was no rush, no edge, just rhythm, depth, breath. He moved inside her slowly, eyes locked on hers, his body trembling with restraint as he gave her everything, every part of him that no one had ever touched. She clung to him, moaning softly into his ear, their bodies perfectly aligned in pace, in pulse, in power. Their climax came together, silent and intense, as if the universe folded around them for a moment and nothing else existed. Afterward, he held her close, her head resting on his chest, his fingers tracing soft circles on her back, and in that stillness he said it. Finally, "I love you." She smiled against his skin. "I know. I've always known." And somewhere deep inside him, something healed. They didn't need the empire. They had each other. And that was the only kingdom worth ruling. The city hadn't changed, but everything about them had. Months passed. Scandals faded. The board meetings stopped calling. Ethan Carter became a different kind of man, no longer the untouchable tycoon behind mirrored glass, but someone who had tasted the chaos of love and chosen it over power. They moved into a quieter place, away from the skyline, with windows that let in morning light and a bed that remembered every curve of their bodies. It wasn't about escape. It was about choosing what mattered. Love, touch, a life that smelled of coffee, skin, and sex. On a rainy afternoon, Ethan stood in the kitchen shirtless, jeans low on his hips, the muscles of his back moving with each breath. Emily leaned against the counter, wearing nothing but his white button-down, slightly damp from the heat of the shower, clinging to the curve of her breasts and barely covering the top of her thighs. He turned, eyes dropping to her bare legs, the buttons strained across her chest. His gaze darkened instantly. "Still mine?" he asked, voice rough. She smirked, crossing the space slowly, hips swaying. "Always," she whispered, placing his hand on the swell of her waist, sliding it down until his fingers gripped the back of her thigh. He pulled her up with ease, setting her on the counter, parting her legs with his body. The shirt rose around her hips, revealing she wore nothing underneath. His hands moved over her skin with practiced worship, fingers trailing the insides of her thighs, mouth brushing her collarbone, tongue flicking over her nipple through the damp cotton. She whimpered, arching toward him. "Touch me, Ethan." He didn't hesitate. His fingers slid through her folds, wet and warm, and she gasped, clutching his shoulders. He kissed her like he owned every inch of her, mouth devouring her neck, hand working between her legs until her thighs trembled and her body begged. Then, without warning, he pushed into her, hard, deep, perfect. She moaned against his mouth, nails digging into his back as he thrust again. Slow at first, then harder as the storm outside grew louder, matching the one inside her. He whispered her name like a prayer, lips grazing her ear. "You're my beginning and my end." Her body clenched around him as she came undone, breath shattered, legs locked around his waist. He followed seconds later, grunting her name as he emptied everything into her, forehead pressed to hers, hands tight on her hips. They stayed there, tangled, breathless, flesh against flesh. The thunder outside no match for what they carried between them. And in that kitchen, with bare skin and burning eyes, they made a promise without words. No matter how the world shifted, no matter what came next, they would choose each other. Every night, every fight, every slow-burning kiss, again and again, because love like theirs wasn't made to be quiet. It was made to be felt, skin to skin, heart to heart, forever. Sometimes love doesn't arrive softly. It crashes in, reckless, consuming, terrifying. It burns through lies, ego, and fear, until all that's left is truth. And when two people survive that fire, they don't just fall in love, they become it. Ethan and Emily weren't perfect. They were flawed, raw, scarred. And that's exactly why it worked. Because the most unforgettable kind of love is the one that sees all of you and stays. Now tell me, have you ever wanted someone so badly it hurt to breathe? Have you ever risked everything just for a chance to be real? Drop your story, your thoughts, or just one word in the comments. Let's talk about the kind of love that wrecks and rebuilds. I'll be waiting there with you, and don't stop here. On the next story, a man with a dark past meets the one woman who refuses to be broken, and what happens between them might just ruin everything he built, or finally set him free.